Welcome to question 68 of Matters Concerning Unjust Accusations. Dr. Thibault. This section here of unjust accusations fits within this bigger frame of dealing with justice. We're dealing under the topic of justice with commutative justice, which is how individuals treat one another, compared to distributive justice, which is how the part compares to the whole within society typically. I mentioned this in the last video, but it seems a little bit, today we might think of this more as distributive justice since the courts are typically the function of the state. So in some ways this is kind of like a functioning of the state. But how St. Thomas is framing this is, how do individuals deal with one another in these situations? So how does a judge as an individual deal with other people within their society, both as within their role as judge, and also just, how far does that role of judge extend into that individual relationship they have between themselves and the rest of society? This one is in terms of those who are the accusers, the accusations. So if somebody is an accuser, how is their relationship with the accused? So it's not really part of distributive justice. It's just how should individuals deal with one another in terms of those relationships, in terms of the accused versus the accuser. Uh, so that is still, I guess, fitting under the commutative justice. Next is an unjust defendant, then an unjust witness, then an unjust attorney, and then we move on to rivalry, and we moved on to other topics. But we have these. We have these 5 topics here that are all kind of clumped together under vices of commutative justice, and these are particularly of the word. So these are of speaking. The previous ones that we were looking at were of deeds before question 68, and they were dealing with murder and maiming and injury to the person through striking or imprisonment or robbery or theft. So those were in terms of deeds, these are in terms of words. So just to kind of frame this, assuming anybody who's watching this video is probably a student of the Summa and is interested in kind of the context, not just the reading of it. Otherwise, you could read it yourself. So some of these I'm doing more just reciting the question, the article, and then going into the detail in it. It's not always the most interesting headline, but some of these they only are interesting in terms of their question. So this one's kind of question driven. Is a person bound to accuse? If you have evidence, should you be required to accuse your neighbor? And leads to a court of law and a judge and a sentence. And St. Thomas, using the contra argument, uses Leviticus, and he says, if anyone sins and hears the voice of one swearing and is a witness either because of himself, has seen, or is privy to it, if he does not utter it, he shall bear his iniquity. So there is a moral imperative here from Scripture to accuse if you are privy to that information, to accuse through your firsthand or through knowledge that you have. And just using a few of the lines from this section, punishment in this life are in the character of medicine. So why would you accuse your neighbor even though it means that they might be going to jail or suffer some type of punishment? Well, St. Thomas says because punishment in this life, although we think of it as fairly extreme, we wouldn't want to do something so extreme to our neighbor. It's really not much of anything compared to eternity and the immortality of the soul. So if a person has to bear punishment in this life, is fairly minor and short compared to if they get away with it and they lived in an unreformed way, an unrepentant way, um, then the person will continue to do it, and then their soul might be damned to hell for all eternity. So this short-term punishment might be better. Even if we look back to the term penitentiary, some old-fashioned kind of term we have for jail, a penitentiary. Well, right in the heart of that word is penance. The purpose of a penitentiary is for a person to perform acts of penance for the salvation of their soul. So to um, say the truth in order that the person be properly judged, in order to properly um, punished, the punishment should be aiming at uh, the salvation of the soul of the individual and also to preserve the public good, the common good. Um, so because of that, you have a duty to tell the truth in that regard in order to bring about two good things: the preservation of the common good and the salvation of the soul of the sinner. So either way, you should care enough about your neighbor in order to accuse if you have that information. Uh, he does have St. Thomas has this bit of a caveat: man should be is bound to accusation provided that he can offer sufficient proof. If a person simply has a hunch or they have circumstantial evidence that isn't particularly um, damning, maybe a person isn't required to just. Not everyone's required to come forward to give their opinion on the matter. That's not required. But if a person has sufficient proof, then they should properly accuse. Um, uh, and then in uh, one of the objections, he talks about a response to the objections. It is most grievous fault to fail to do what one is bound to do, since virtuous acts are the perfection of man. So even if a person were excommunicated or a criminal themselves or otherwise cut off, everyone is bound uh, to do the to tell the truth and to properly accuse, because it aims toward the perfection of man. So if a criminal knows the guilt of another criminal, you can say, well, what, a criminal isn't a criminal's already a criminal. Well, but part of the penitential aspect of being a criminal would be for your reform, and part of your reform, part of your medicine in this life could be being truthful. Uh, we kind of have this idea that criminals don't rat out other criminals, but um, if a criminal is truly repentant, then they should. If they're repentant, then they should. That might be moving them towards uh, their forgiveness by being honest. Uh, Another one, a contra argument, and number two would I gave it its own slide, but subjects are debarred from the accusation of their superiors uh, if it is not the affection of charity, but their own wickedness that leads them to defame and disparage the conduct of their superiors. So um, I guess superiors could be in multiple ways. It could be political. It could be probably, if you're from a Catholic perspective, the idea of a superior thinks of a religious superior. Um, Ecclesiastical superior, your priest, your bishop, um, your boss at work, the superiors in many ways. So if our if our reason for accusing them is because we're trying to bring them down, then it's our own wickedness doing it. But we should be doing it out of charity. This is a little out of date with our modern day thinking, but this idea that kind of a classical idea that our superiors, the people who are the head of our nation, our church, our culture, have some type of divine mandate, some divine will to be in the positions that they're in, and we should give them respect because of their position that God has allowed them to hold. Um, Therefore, we should love them. We should aim at loving them. We should try to support them. We see this somewhat liturgically, both in the Catholic Church and then in other churches like the Episcopal Church. For example, you'll see a lot of prayers for the king, or prayers for the queen, prayers for the president, prayers for your nation. This idea is that you should have this love of your superiors, and the superiors should have the love of their people. There's kind of this model. Um, Another example would be like husbands be, wives be subservient to your husbands, this type of thing. A wife should love her husband and be subservient to him, and then he should equally love her back and protect and defend her. So it's this reciprocal relationship that isn't uh, perfectly equal, but equal in terms of responsibilities and affection. So, kind of an interesting line there. Does the accusation need to be made in writing? Now, this is an interesting one as well because what he's really getting at in the present day, it wouldn't have to be in writing according to be Thomistic, but what would be needed would be a some record of what is being accused very specifically. So it could either be in writing, um, it could be spoken but transcribed, it could be videotaped, it could be digitally taped, whatever we're doing today. It could be recorded, voice recorded, but there needs to be a record of it, what was specifically said as it was being said. In St. Thomas's example, some of these things you think he just wrote this the other day, nearly 1,000 years ago. But he says, if several people hear the same thing, hear the same words, and then they're later asked what was said, uh, everybody has a different idea of what was said, and everybody's quoting back something that's a paraphrase of some form, but not exactly what was said. Because of this, the accuser's words should be recorded in some way, exactly what they said, because an accusation needs to be specific and not paraphrased, because a person's life is on the line, whether it's for the death penalty or their freedom and imprisonment, but it's very serious. So therefore, the words, and specifically what was accused, matters. It's not roughly what was said. What was said matters in this regard to the accused. Um, but he does point out that there's another form that's more done by the church rather than by the civil legal system, which is denouncing. But he says denouncing is not aimed at punishment, right? And punishment, in some sense, is a medicine for the soul, civil capacity. Denouncing is aims at amending the person in their actions, and this does not require proof to the same level because a person who is denounced doesn't lose their freedom. They're being scolded publicly, but proof wouldn't be necessarily needed. So, if somebody were to be drinking too much or something like that and causing a problem, you don't have to have evidence in the same exact way in order to pull the person aside and to denounce them with their drinking and say you need to get help. Because the person doesn't go to jail for this, the person doesn't death penalty for this. Person is aimed at the accusation is aimed at amending the person's life while they're still continuing on with their everyday life. But it is saying you can't continue in the same capacity in some regard. So they will you can't still be the pastor of the church while you're an active raging alcoholic. You need to get help. That's different than a trial, I think, for fairly aware of that. So because it's not a trial, it doesn't need the same level of evidence and the same level of accusation, the same level of recording as just telling somebody that they need to amend their life. Then there is, I keep having these things where I'm putting the wrong article in it, but I believe this is Article 3. Um, uh, the unjust accusation, calumny, which Bishop Robert Barron talks about a lot, collusion, or evasion are three topics. What if the accuser is guilty of one of these three? Is that the accusations are aimed at the common good, which aims at procuring knowledge of the crime. So, again, as stated before, an accuser is to bring forth proof of the crime that was committed, some kind of knowledge, some type of truth of the knowledge of what was committed. Calumny is charging falsely the commission of a crime. It's one who is intentionally deceiving in order to destroy another person's reputation or to destroy the person. So if you're purposefully falsely charging somebody, that would be clearly uh, an unjust accusation, fairly straightforward. The second one is on the part of the Commonwealth, which is where someone is aiming at the public good in some sense, but they are deceiving in such a way in order to try to bring it about. Perhaps they don't have enough evidence themselves, or whatever reason, that they act in collusion with the state. So they say, well, we know this person's really a mobster. We know they're a mobster. We know they're a murderer. We know this. But we don't have any witnesses because they kill all the witnesses. For example, they bury all the evidence. We can't get something against them, but we finally caught this person. So we need somebody to make up a story. We need somebody to lie in order to go along with this, in order to convict this clearly guilty person. Therefore, for the good of the Commonwealth, we need you to lie. Uh, this type of accusation would be collusion. You're colluding with the government. So this isn't just somebody who's come up with an idea in some type of proof, and now it's up to the judge to decide. This is somebody who's working, in some sense, with the judge. So the person being accused doesn't have a shot at all if they're working with the judge. This term in the Latin, vericatio, the vericatio part of it is this idea of straddling, like somebody who's straddling um, between two walls or something like that, where you're supposed to be on one side, but you're kind of playing both sides. You're playing impartial, whereas you are in collusion with the other side. Therefore, it's unfair. The other one is evasion, where you have proof and you say, "Oh, I don't know anything." And you might, this is an example, kind of, if somebody kind of came forward with an accusation and then they talk with people in the government and they come to this idea, okay, I'm not going to come forward. I'm not going to say anything, which the Latin term here, uh, tergiversatio, is this idea of turning your back on something. So you're turning your back on it. It's evasion. So you have proof and you've recanted your evidence. All three of these would be unjust accusations. This fourth article, the last article, is probably the most interesting and controversial one, and that is, should the person, let's say a person makes an accusation and it turns out that it was the person is not guilty of the thing that the accuser has accused them of, should the accuser then have to face that punishment? Now, this isn't really something that's consistent with contemporary legal systems. We don't really do this. People might have a countersuit today, but there's not this idea that there's a trial, somebody's going to jail, or somebody's going to be hung. Well, it's either the accuser or the accused, so, but somebody's going to pay. I guess that would get rid of some of the lawsuits we have today if it required that somebody would be going to jail, uh, either the accused or the accused, but somebody would be going to jail. You would have to make sure that you really had a strong case if you're going to go forward with that one. Um, Otherwise, you might be the one going to jail. And the quote taken in the Contra is a line from Pope Hadrian, which was, "He that fails to prove his accusation must himself suffer the punishment which his accusation inferred." So, fairly serious line coming from Pope Hadrian. Um, on the topic of justice, this comes up because the equality of justice requires that a man should himself suffer what harm he has intended to be inflicted on another. So it's justice. If you're accusing somebody of something wrongly, um, well, for that scale of justice to be equal, well, then they won't pay the penalty. You will pay the penalty for your false accusation. An eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. That line comes up fairly frequently in um, these questions on justice. Something we're not so keen on those lines anymore. An eye for an eye and a tooth leaves all men blind. But it's still quite popular for St. Thomas. He then says, though, because this would be too much probably if this were universally accepted, that any person who maybe you had proof, but you didn't have enough proof. Well, isn't that up for the judge to decide if it's enough proof? If you didn't lie, if you just told the truth and it wasn't enough evidence to convict, we shouldn't punish the person who just came forward to tell what they knew. I know this is an accuser, not a witness, but since there's an overlap here, if somebody thinks they saw something, then you don't want to punish innocent parties. Well, that's when St. Thomas then says, well, it really depends on if this is voluntary or involuntary. This is the same idea of the calumny issue. If you knew that the person did not do the thing you are accusing them of, you are voluntarily um, making up false narratives about this person in order to convict them. That is voluntary, therefore, this line of Pope Hadrian comes to full effect. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Um, if you're going to make false claims, then it's going to be action against you. Now, this could be on a court of law, right? If you have perjured yourself, you have lied under oath, well, then yeah, you could go to jail under the modern system. So, in some regards, that remains. The involuntary option is what involuntary deserves forgiveness. And this is, to quote Rudy Giuliani in one of his testimonies from My Cousin Vinny, this idea of the old woman with the glasses, and she thinks she knew that those were the guys that committed the murder in My Cousin Vinny, but she is really mostly blind. So in her mind, she's confident that she saw what she saw, um, but in fact, she was wrong because of her ignorance over the ability of her own eyesight, and maybe ignorance over the idea that she's not aware that her mind is filling in the details. She saw two guys, she didn't know which two guys, and her imagination filled in the detail when she saw them. This wasn't done maliciously. It's not done voluntarily intending to deceive. It's done involuntarily out of ignorance. Therefore, it would then deserve to be forgiven. Some level of forgiveness. And you can know this because, like, well, what would she gain by this lie? What would be in it for her for doing this? She clearly might just be confused. Therefore, she shouldn't have an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. So I think in that regard, this is consistent with the modern system. Although on its face, it looks immediately like it's inconsistent. The last part that was brought in there is that you can't remove disgrace, which is brought up. Um, and that is, even if you say, you went and you made a false accusation, that woman with the thick eyeglasses that couldn't really see what was going on. Okay, she can be forgiven. You're not going to throw her in jail for her ignorance on being a false accusation, but the disgrace remains. And this is to the degree in which a person might face public backlash for their claims. Even uh, even the lines within there say, we can forgive, and we can. The church has the ability to forgive, but it doesn't have the ability to remove the disgrace. And I think the term in the Latin is infamia, but I think infamy, that's essentially the word. It's been translated to English into disgrace, but probably infamy, closer to the Latin, is the more accurate way of looking at it. You can't remove the infamy of making false accusations. Again, it's probably socially to the degree in which a person, if we think of the Supreme Court Justice Kavanaugh being sworn in, you have the woman who's accusing him of sexual abuse many years ago, and she can't remember the day, she can't remember the place, she can't remember a lot of the details, but she's making an accusation. The consequence for people who supported Brett Kavanaugh for Supreme Court Justice is that they treat her with infamy. This idea that um, she might not be making it up. She might have filled in the gaps in her memory. She's putting things together. Um, and she didn't go to jail for what she said, but she might have a reputation now, which is one of the reasons why many women who have suffered for sexual abuse don't want to come forward to make an accusation, is because they don't want to face the infamy. And there's nothing anyone can do, whether the church or the state or anybody else, to relieve infamy. Infamy is public opinion, and you can't tell the public what their opinion is on these matters. So, and I'm not trying to say she was making something up or anything. I'm just using that as an example that if you were a supporter of Kavanaugh and you didn't believe her, then infamy would be the response. I guess you could throw out the other side. Brett Kavanaugh was accusing her of lying, Therefore, he might have a certain infamy with another part of the country, right? Degree of infamy on both sides, depending on where you stand on an issue. I try not to get into politics or sides within this video, so you might read into it some one way or another, but I'm not making a statement one way or another. In conclusion, the accuser, which is kind of another name for Satan, the accuser, is a man is bound to accuse if he has sufficient proof. That's fair enough. An accuser needs to be put on record to preserve justice. St. Thomas said writing, but now with modern instruments, we could probably use other things to record the writing, because really the specific detail of the thing being accused is very pertinent to whether or not we think that the person actually did it or not. We want to know specifically what was being accused, not let our minds fill in the gaps, which is often the problem within these things. The sins of calumny and collusion or evasion are issues that one shouldn't seek out in their own mind. The what's best for society by swaying the case through lies in order to try to get your point across. You should just stick with the facts. The facts. What do you know? What do you see? What can you prove? And then that should be it. That should be a matter of trying to say whatever needs to be said expediently to bring about whatever you want to do. And lastly, if there was a false accusation, really it breaks down to, is this a voluntary or an involuntary injury that was caused? Because if somebody is guilty of calumny or collusion, and it leads to injury, then an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, according to St. Thomas in the book of Exodus. And if it was involuntary through ignorance, then we should forgive. The person's reputation who made the false accusation will face public opinion, and there's nothing anyone can do about public opinion. So that's it about the false accusations, the unjust accusers. And next, we will move on. What is the next one? Next one is the unjust defendant. So we'll move on to the unjust defendant next time. I hope you have a good day.